Thank you. Sorry, I hit the unmute about 3 times, so it was not cooperating. So thanks for joining this exciting session, and I know that our time is tight, so I'm going to jump right in. I'm Vincent LaFranza, President and CEO of NMPHI. For those of you who I haven't met, welcome, special welcome from our network. As you know, we have 2 very special speakers in this multi-sector partnership session today, the Honorable Congresswoman Barbara Lee of California and Dr. Marcus Hunter, Professor of Sociology and African American Studies at UCLA, and the co-chair of the National Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Movement. Both, of course, have very impressive bios, and I'm not going to read them today, but Dr. Hunter will kick us off and introduce Congresswoman Lee for us. First, I just want to share 2 interesting facts about Dr. Hunter that I learned recently. He is the coiner of Black Lives Matter, and he's also the Scott Wow Endowed Chair in the Division of Social Sciences. Among several impressive books, he has a new book coming out soon, Radical Reparations, and that will be coming out with HarperCollins publisher. So a warm network welcome to you, Marcus, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for having me here. Thank you, Vinny, for that wonderful introduction. I'll just start off by telling folks a little bit about how I came to Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation, and also how the Congresswoman plays a role in that. And I believe by that point, we'll also have the Congresswoman here as well. So just to give people a little background, about 4 years ago, I was in my home. I'm out here in Los Angeles, and I was at home and I got a call from a number I don't know. So like most people, my intention was to not answer it. You know, like I just, you know, I'm still a screener of calls. So I am screening a call and it's like some DC number or something. And so I say, you know what, I'm going to, you know, take this call. Let me just take a chance. So I answer the call and it's, hello, can we speak to Marcus Hunter? I said, yes, sure. Thinking to myself, like, oh my gosh, do I owe bills in DC? You know, like, what is this call about? So I take the call. I say, okay, I'm going to say, this is my real name. Hi, yes, I am Marcus Hunter. And it said, hi, I am the Deputy Chief of Staff, Liz Lee, for Representative Barbara Lee. And she's on the line and would like to speak to you. And so I nearly like dropped the phone, like, what could I have done to warrant this experience today? So no sooner than I could like come out of shock, I then hear her beautiful voice on the phone and she says, hi, is this Professor Hunter? And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, she's called me professor as well. Oh, I'm just like on a roll. What did I do to deserve this? And so she said she had been on a flight going from one place to another, and she happened to catch C-SPAN Book TV, which had been covering the LA Times Book Festival. And she had watched a panel that I had moderated on slavery. So there were several authors who had written books on slavery, and I was the moderator of the conversation. And she said, you know, I watched that whole interview, I watched that whole panel discussion, and it was riveting, was so good. And I just watched it and I thought to myself, I have to find this young Black man and I have to tell him he does such a wonderful job. I just really have to tell him that. And, you know, I thought to myself, you know, I could, you know, just end right here, just, you know, prop me up like this, give me the flowers, you know, I'm done. And she said, you know, I noticed that you were talking about slavery. And you were very informed about it. And you mentioned that you were working on reparations. And I wanted to see if you might be interested in working on truth, racial healing, and transformation. It is a vision that I have for the country where we finally get our act together and we create a truth, racial healing, and transformation commission. I know you're a very busy person, but if you're available, I would love to have you, you know, join on. And I said, of course, you know, like, you know, and the next thing I knew, I was in a meeting with Dr. Gail Christopher, who is the conceiver of the concept of truth, racial healing, and transformation. And she and I joined Congresswoman Barbara Lee at her office in DC with Tom Perriello, former rep out of Virginia. And we started then what became now the resolution for truth, racial healing, and transformation. So I tell you that background to say, that is how I came into the convergence of leadership and also on drafting the legislation and working with the Honorable Barbara Lee. And to give you a little backdrop about how also me and Gail Christopher came into Convergence as well. And she and I, along with Mike Wenger and Tom Perriello and a host of other folks, have been working together with folks like Vinny here and many, many, many others to finally get America to join the 40+ nations that have already done a truth and healing process so that we can live in a healthier, freer, more just society. So I give that long intro, and I know we're awaiting the Congresswoman, but I'm happy to, talk here. I'll follow your lead, Vinny, if you want to, guide me a little bit too.
Yeah, so we know Barbara's going to join us any minute. She said to start the session, and she's coming from another meeting, and we know how this works. So I think for this group in public health, it would just be great, Marcus, to talk a little bit about, you mentioned there's, 40 other countries, a little bit of context about the process, and then.
We lost you again, Vinny.
You're on mute.
Yeah, I think I heard you say a little context about the process, and then it went out.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my computer keeps going back to mute on automatic. I don't know why. So much for technology. Just for public health to say, what is our role? How do we engage? What's your advice for us? I mean, because these are folks, in communities on the front lines, doing a little bit of different type of work, but it's all related, right?
Yeah. No, thank you for that. I mean, what is great about being before a group like this is that you all also get particular things about the price of lives, meaning, for example, when we think that Black women are not of equal value to other people, those women experience stress, anxiety, lack of support, lack of protection that produces things like cortisol rates, that produces cancer, that produces things that we know kill people. And so the idea here is that in the health world, unlike other worlds, there's a clear understanding of the cost of cultural mindsets on our well-being, social, emotional, and mental. That when we are educated to think less of others, then it affects those who are thought of as less in deeply, deeply physical and physiological ways. In addition to, I think what's important here for me, and this is something I go around with a lot, is a great proverb from Ghana that says, a lie can destroy 1,000 truths. I use that proverb often, one, as a reminder that many of us who are descendants of slavery come from Ghana originally. So the wisdom of that location, of that nation is powerful. And what it's saying is that just one lie, for example, Black people are less human, can destroy 1,000 truths. Like, for example, Black families are families. Black lives matter. We can go down a list of truths about Black people that are deeply disturbed or corrupted by the lie about our humanity. And part of what happens here and what's important about a truth process is that it's about building out a vision where you jettison the belief in a value of human hierarchy and a belief that there is a racial hierarchy. And why that's important in part is because people go, well, what do belief systems do? Well, they, one, program your brain to operate in particular ways, to send chemical registers through the rest of your body based on premises that may actually be false and dangerous, both to yourself and to others. And so part of what truth, racial healing, and transformation is about is thinking about the cost of and trauma around believing in and having a mindset that has pervaded long after slavery, that there is a systematic value of human hierarchy, that there is a racial hierarchy that is justifiable and legitimate. And we then give people, I say, a steady diet of these things. So part of why people believe that Black people's humanity is not the same is not just because they want to believe it, but because they're fed it in textbooks. They're fed it in pamphlets. When you go to a hospital, who's the makeup? Who is the reference point? It's a white woman's body or a white man's body. So it's saying, oh, these people are different. When you're a Black person in hospitals, I did a long autopsy of the public health department and the experience of African ancestry folks in San Jose for about 2 years. from 2014 to 2016. And one major finding, which wouldn't surprise the group here, is that Black people were afraid to go to healthcare providers for their lack of cultural competency. So what's also happening is that as a Black person, I know I'm going through something that is important that I need to seek a medical professional for, but I am avoiding it because I believe that they don't value my humanity, that they will see me as different. And then also what we know with our elders, Black elders, they often need support. They need a kinfolk or a fictive kin to go along with them to be their advocate, because Black elderly people are actually least likely to report their real injuries, their real health concerns, because they're afraid of being hospitalized on site. They're afraid of not being able to go back home. And then they're also not allowed to bring people with them. And many people in the medical industry, the professionals, are not always aware that having that advocate really matters and really helps you further diagnose and get the right prognosis for your patient. So part of what Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation is about is getting to the root of that and talking about the fact that, for example, it costs us lives and money. Racism does. The belief in a human hierarchy cost us lives and money. And I think we all have seen it in the COVID-19 crisis, that it is costing us lives and money. And we could put a Band-Aid on it by saying, oh, we're going to target Black populations for vaccination and things like that. But Band-Aids are called Band-Aids for a reason, and surgery is called surgery for a reason. And we can continue to give Band-Aids where surgery is needed. But I think Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation represents that surgery that America needs.
Marcus, I've had the privilege of working with Gail for many years, Dr. Christopher, and she often talks about how racism impacts all of us, and there is a need for healing, regardless of, what your maybe outward skin color might appear to be, or other issues of oppression. Can you say anything about the process relating to that?
Yeah, I think the very first thing is, and this is about the steady diet, that this is why racial healing is necessary, to put out positive images about Black people, about people of color, to try to combat the negative diet of information that has been fed. Because what happens is people here, for example, I'm a teacher at UCLA. I teach a class, let's say I call the class, if I called it Intro to Sociology. Many of the students will experience that as a broad-ranging class that is covering so many topics. If I put the word Black in front of it, Black sociology, now it's a limited, specific, constrained, precise thing that doesn't apply to a lot of people. So part of that says to me that you're being fed a steady diet that tells you when you hear the word Black, turn your mind off. Don't listen any further. It does not apply to you. What if that is costing you money and costing you your life? That is part of what Barbara Lee knows, and that's why she's been really spearheading and pioneering Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation as a commission and other legislative components to effectuate this, because this is a broad problem that has historical origins in the foundation of the country. And part of what happens is people wait until like a January 6th to realize the country needs a racial healing. I mean, wow, we're really far gone here. Like, wow, racism is a sickness. It's not just like a belief system. It will make you sick. It will make you go and break laws. It will make you violate people's rights. It will make you violent. It will make you scary. It will make you carry guns and use chemical weapons on people in the Capitol. So part of what I think we have to come to is an acceptance that, one, for whatever reason, we've been Jedi mind tricked to hear, for example, the word Black and put it in front of something, and now it's not expansive, it's not inclusive, it's very specific, and it's not for me. So part of that is to say, because that's a lie. And the lie is destroy all of the 1,000 ways that we can be connected to each other. And I would say, does the white people who believe the lie some serious mental, physical, and physiological harm, in addition to the harm that we see they're inflicting, but on yourself. To think less of another human being is to do something to yourself. You're saying something about yourself. We're all mirrors for each other. So if I believe you're less human than me, then I believe I'm less human. That belief system then means that I don't have all of my capacity. I'm not in touch with my full humanity if I believe other people who are human are not. So it's about getting to that Jedi mind trick understanding and accepting that it's at the origin of the foundation of America alongside native dispossession of land, that these two things, the ability to dehumanize Black people and native populations, to go forward and defame their humanity is the cost that we're living in. And what Barbara Lee is asking us to do through Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation is to acknowledge, accept it, properly memorialize it, then create transformational policies that prevent and mitigate it from happening any further.
Great. So we have some questions coming in as well, and I'm going to read one of them. As public health is declaring racism as a public health as a real crisis in this country, are there public health entities also identifying reparations as a public health intervention? It's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think this is, for us at least, this is one of our early sessions.
Yeah, thanks for that. I was fortunate enough, so for folks, I love any questions about reparations always. And as a piece of background, Barbara Lee was one of the original endorsers and co-sponsors of HR 40, first put forward by former Rep. The ancestor John Conyers, and now also working in collaboration with Sheila Jackson Lee. And so both of these pieces of legislation are symbiotic, and it's intentionally in support of each other, because I think we need a reparations plus model, because part of what happens is people will think about, oh, you give people reparations and you're kind of done with it. But what about that steady diet of misinformation, false humanity, hierarchy of human value? You have to do something about that, and you need transformational policies that prevent something like American slavery to happen again and again in different forms that people have said. So firstly, that's one piece just on the backdrop of the legislation and its connection to HR 40. The other thing is, just this morning, I was very delighted to be on the live judiciary hearing for HR 40, which is moving forward in the process and has been able to get to that level of conversation. And in that, they were talking about Representative Sheila Jackson Lee was just reporting a Harvard study that had found the financial and health costs of racism in the trillions, costing us every single day in the trillions. I mean, earlier in the week, Heather McGee, whose book just came out, The Sum of Us, just came out yesterday. She's the daughter of Dr. Gail Christopher, who I was mentioning here. And during her CBS interview, which you can find online, she mentions Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation as a framework that can mitigate and prevent. But also part of what they talk about there, and she uses this powerful metaphor, which is also adorning the book, of the drained pool in the South that happens after you get integration. That what we see in white communities in the South is that they rather drain the public pool than to have it. So just thinking about how what happens in racism is the Jedi mind trick tells you to deprive yourself as a white person of a resource rather than share it with a Black person. So imagine what that does. That means no swimming for anybody in that community. We know swimming to have all sorts of health benefits. We also know it to have spiritual benefits. We also know it to be a public good. And what racism told people was, drain that pool. Nobody swims. So it's sort of like corporal punishment, like everybody suffers. Integration, no pool, no schools, no supermarket, no bank, no loans, no homes, no hospitals, food desert, medical desert. That's what racism does to the mindset of white people. They would rather deprive themselves than to share something. And why? Because they've been conditioned on a diet that Black people are subhuman. So why would I share my resource with somebody who's less human than me? And if it becomes Black, doesn't that mean that's not for me anymore? That's back to those mindsets that have physiological, mental, and economic warfare and tolls that they take on us as a people.
So keep the questions coming. Barbara will be here in about 3 minutes. Yeah, Marcus, can you say anything about any experiences you have working with different age groups? Are there intergenerational issues in America that we should be aware of?
Yeah, I love that question. And, I myself am aging out of youth, even though I have my boyish charm. So, I'm older than I appear. But one thing I think, and this is what the election reveals, the election that we all have survived, hopefully, We have survived the election cycle. And that is that the pervading wisdom following the civil rights movement was that diversity in classrooms would save us with youth, that people, racists would effectively age out and die. And we would have diverse classrooms where the engagement between the young people would help us see each other share humanity. And what I see just as a sociologist and trained statistician is that if the votes were about 80 plus million to 76 million, that means 1 in 1.5 of us voted for Trump, which means that young people did it of various ages, of various demographic categories, and old people did it. So this idea that diverse classrooms and youth will save us from the pandemic and epidemic of racism is a lie. And again, what do lies do? Destroy 1,000 troops. So this idea that the young people are just so beyond racism and they don't get it, it's like, no, they just got some finesse and savvy around it because they also selected something that people would think young people would not have selected. So I think that the election should be a reminder to us that we're not so far along and we cannot just rely on people dying and people being young to eradicate the cultural mindset that there is a hierarchy of human value. That requires a truth commission, that requires reparations, that requires acknowledgement, and that requires transformational policies that accept that reality and foundation and move us forward in a more positive direction.
Thank you. Another question, Mark, is for you. In terms of just the public health folks that want to learn more about the process, how should they go about that?
Oh, yeah, no problem. There are a couple of places. One, the leadership group has been using ustrht.org, where you can find who the other leaders are and follow through there. There's also Dr. Gail Christopher. You can follow her. She has a lot of information that you can find during her time at Kellogg. Also, Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation became a key pillar of their work. You can find out more information through them. You can also find in the 116th Congress, H-Con Res 100. You can find that as well, which actually has the resolution in the language. You can also find out more information through hashtag Breathe With Me Revolution, which has done 2 very successful PSAs on truth, racial healing, and transformation, and Congresswoman Lee's efforts to pioneer a commission in the United States. You have one that does activists, that you see them actually reading the resolution alongside Congresswoman Lee in a very powerful 3-minute piece put together with Now This and hashtag Breathe With Me. You also can find on MLK Day, in honor of that, 17 celebrities, including Alicia Keys, Beyonce, and Mary J. Blige, joined together to then call forward the call for 100 days within the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration to get a Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission, where they talk about 17 more ways you can be killed while being Black in America. And they outline that as a push through Now This and hashtag Breathe With Me about the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission. So you got PSAs that you can find out there that are in 6 minutes. You can educate yourself and get a frequency for it. I think the other thing here is that I would say, as public health professionals and advocates, you all are on the front lines of re-educating and reframing people's mindsets about our shared humanity and the cost on us physiologically and economically in believing in a false system.
Another great question came in from a health department. Our language matters. The policy that we make matters. How can we change this as a local health department?
Yeah, I think, one thing that the pandemic has brought forward, I know powerfully in Los Angeles, hearing the public health director here publicly say Black women are predisposed to all sorts of ailments that make them vulnerable to COVID more than any other group. I was listening to that going, I don't know ever in American history, in all of the archives I've excavated, I've read, all of the interviews I've done, to hear public health officials in cities like Los Angeles and New York and Philadelphia and so on say Black people, Black women in particular, are predisposed based on conditions that they do not create to die sooner and faster of a virus that is killing us all. So one thing that I've seen from public health departments that maybe is not something that they understand as powerful, but is happening because of the necessities of COVID, is saying those kinds of things, putting out those kinds of frameworks for people to understand and conceptualize what is happening, to center Black women's health. I mean, for example, when I went to San Jose doing public health, one fascinating tidbit about San Jose, and I covered this in my book with Andrea Robinson, called Chocolate Cities. We do a whole thing about San Jose and what leads me there. I was born in the great city of Newark. Shout out to Dionne Warwick. The song, Do You Know the Way to San Jose? That is how the place comes into my horizon. When I got there, I thought to myself, there are Black people in San Jose. Dionne Warwick was right. I had no idea, so I'm listening to the song, I'm talking to the folks, and I did a whole, as I mentioned to people, basically autopsy of Black people's experience with healthcare in San Jose. And what was fascinating to me about San Jose was it had all of the indicators of doing what the civil rights movement said we should do. That is, it said if Black people had higher education and access to college, access to better employment, and access to home ownership, we would look up and 60 years later, they would be looking like and having white outcomes in terms of family, prosperity with their children, wealth, and such. What was so deeply fascinating to me was that not only were Black folks in San Jose having outcomes for themselves and their children that look more like poor and working class Black families on the south side of Chicago, okay, than upper middle class Black people, but that they were dying of cancer at higher rates, colon and breast cancer, than their white counterparts and their Latino counterparts and their Asian American counterparts. But then when I looked at the household income, it was nearly double the household income of Black households across the country. So they are bringing in double the household income. When I looked at their education, they're college plus. So double the college, double the education, SES, of the average Black household. But they're having the same infant mortality as Memphis, same Black maternal mortality as Memphis, poor and working class Black families. So the question for me became, so getting a better job, getting a master's degree, and owning a home ain't doing a damn thing. People are still dying. So then we have to return back to the civil rights movement and say, we did the housing, we did the education, and our children are being suspended at the same rates as poor and working class children who are Black in Philadelphia, in San Jose. Our children are being expelled from school at the same rates as poor and working class children in Dallas, Texas, in San Jose. And it's the Silicon Valley. They are dying of higher rates of testicular cancer and breast cancer and colon cancer. And this is supposed to be the digital capital, the tech capital of the world. How is that happening? The answer is racism. And what was fascinating to me is when I interviewed the Black folks there, they were often reluctant to say racism, which I report back in the book to say, and for all of the white people who think Black people like to, quote, play a race card, they don't play it. You have to talk with them and do focus groups and figure it out before they're actually feeling comfortable to say, you know what, when I think about it, racism is killing me and my family.
Wonderful, wonderful response. So Marcus, I know Rep. Lee is in the room now with us, so back to you.
So it gives me great pleasure to introduce the honorable Representative Congresswoman, visionary, courageous, lion-hearted woman that we know as Representative Barbara Lee from California's 13th district. She has served that district and me and us since 1998. She is, to me, one of the legendary daughters from the house of Shirley Chisholm. I just am so grateful that she's founded to find me, to include me in her vision to achieve truth, racial healing, and transformation in these United States. I welcome to the group the Honorable Barbara Lee.
Wow. Listen, Dr. Hunter, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be with you. I apologize for being late. I'm doing 16 things at once, but this is so important. And I just have to say, I met you through an interview on MSNBC. This is how so just know what network I watch. And that's how I met you. And I met Dr. Hunter because I was in the process of thinking through the establishment of a Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission. And I said, boy, if there's anybody who understands this and gets it, who I want to be an advisor, who I want to help me formulate this commission, is Dr. Hunter. And so I'm just so delighted to know you and your work, and to be able now to work with you. And listening to you leading, I got on as you were concluding your teaching and preaching. That I thought I'd say, you were absolutely right. I live in the Bay Area. My district's Oakland, Berkeley, California. Some of the highest childhood poverty rates comparable to Mississippi. Some of the highest COVID rates in terms of transmission of the virus and the vaccine, the inequity in the vaccine distribution in primarily African-American communities, Black and brown communities. I have enormous wealth in my district, but the average income of a Black family is like $40-some thousand compared to a white family at 100-some thousand. So the disparities are real, and race is a factor in every single aspect of American life. And in California, oftentimes we're not even seen and don't even want to talk about, as you said, race. But I just have to tell you, structural racism is alive and well in California and throughout the country. White supremacy is in the DNA of this country, and it's in the healthcare system, as manifested now by the health disparities and the disproportionate rates of people dying, Black people dying from COVID. And so I want to just mention the bill that I introduced with Senator Warren and Congresswoman Presley. It's the Anti-Racism in Public Health Act, which seeks to recognize and address disparities in our public health systems, which have been so clearly illustrated by the COVID-19 pandemic. But there's far more to do to make our policies anti-racist, and that's what we have to do. The first step is we have to acknowledge that racism is a public health crisis. It is. Racism in many ways causes the stress that causes early deaths. And the disproportionate rates of deaths as it relates to the years that Black men live on this earth. Racism is directly related to that. It's an issue that lies at the root of inequity in our socioeconomic system. So it's work that we've got to build upon to build on to really provide for a more equitable nation. Many states, they stand strong on this issue, and we at the federal level, we have to commit to addressing racism. And so within this bill, we're going to establish a department of the Center for Disease Control to really address and look at how we can really move forward to dismantle these systems in the healthcare system, which allow for the disproportionate rates of death and the underlying diseases and all of the health disparities, and also as it relates to police misconduct and how racism as a public health issue is part of the whole criminal justice system. And so it's so important that we have this truth-telling moment in America, and that's what you're doing today, and that's what you're about. And establishing the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission really will get to the structural issues, because you laid out what we've done over the past 401 years, really, in terms of the civil rights movement. But we have to go back and realize we haven't cracked those chains of slavery yet. We after 401 years ago, after the Civil War, what you had Reconstruction, but then you had, of course, the Black codes, you had segregation, you had Jim Crow, you had lynchings, you have discriminatory laws and policies, much of which still are existing in this country. And so while we made progress, we haven't dealt with the truth of what happened with enslaved persons and their descendants here in America. And so we have to have this day of reckoning where the truth comes forward, and that's the only way you can move forward to heal. And you hear people talking about now, oh, we need to heal, we need to heal. Well, you can't heal and you can't reconcile. You can't move forward unless you have the truth told, and the victims of this sinister, these crimes against humanity put forward in a historical context so that the public understands why you see Mr. George Floyd being killed by the police, why you see the COVID pandemic disproportionately affecting Black and brown people. the context of systemic racism, why there's housing discrimination, why we die earlier. All of that has to be addressed and can be traced right back to 401 years ago. The public has to understand that, and we have to bring this forward. And finally, I'll just say, part of this effort is reparations. We've got to repair this damage. We can't move forward and transform this country and its policies and its framework for dealing with racial equity unless we repair the damage of the past. Black people didn't have the wealth through, I mean, you just look at the subprime crisis and what they did to those of us who own homes with these loan sharks who really wiped out all of any equity that we would have had in any home ownership to transfer to our children. We don't even have that anymore. So this transfer of wealth through the generations, we never got our 40 acres and a mule, really. So we never had a chance to acquire wealth to transfer to our descendants. So this thing, racism, anti-racism initiatives has to be developed in every structure in our country. And we have to know that reparations is about repairing this damage, because we'll never get to a country that's equitable and just as it relates to Black and brown people unless we have this truth-telling moment and establish the facts of the realities of America for people who have been marginalized, especially for African Americans. So thank you again. I don't want to keep talking, and Dr. Hunter, because you're the preacher and the teacher, but I just wanted to say hello to everyone and just know how much I appreciate you all digging deep and taking this deep dive and really looking at what it means in terms of anti-racist policies and addressing this head on.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lee. Wonderful to have you with us. I know you may have to run, but we're going to ask you questions until you can't be with us. So,
okay, what time is it? Yeah, just wait a minute. Let me. What time is it now? Okay, got 10 minutes.
All right, we got 10 minutes. Okay. First question is from us in public health. What's the best way we can support your legislation?
Well, the best way, really, this is about numbers, getting co-sponsors for bills, is to everyone know who your member of Congress is, know who your senator is, and go tell them to sign on. Senator Warren has introduced it in the Senate, so have them contact Senator Warren. I've introduced it, and Congresswoman Presley in the House. And so the big thing right now is numbers, is going to whomever represents you and just hold them accountable to signing on to this legislation.
Okay, consider that done. Another question that comes in, Congresswoman Lee, part of what we are doing is trying to reimagine how we create access to resources. What comments do you have about multi-sector partnerships? How can we reimagine this redistribution?
Sure, and I'm on the Appropriations Committee, and that's probably what I've been doing for the last 14 years on the Appropriations Committee without a lot of support. But now I think after the brutal events of last year, now all of a sudden people beginning to understand structural racism and how we need to unpack that and dismantle that. And so in reimagining it, we have to say, look, we're going to put resources, we're going to, first of all, cut this military budget by 10%. Okay, that's $72 billion. We can do a lot with $72 billion because the Pentagon identified over 150 billion in waste, fraud, and abuse. We can use at least a 10% cut and use that 72 billion to put into our communities for healthcare, for housing, for education, for whatever, for climate initiatives, for whatever we think. And so basically reimagining for me is taking money away from the Pentagon, which they don't need. And I'm not talking about diminishing our national security or not protecting our troops or our personnel. I'm talking about the waste, fraud, and abuse, cutting that budget, reimagining for starters 10% of it and putting it into what we need to empower and build up our communities. And we have a bill that's coming up. Again, I'd urge and encourage everyone to ask your member of Congress to support the Lee Pocan amendment to cut 10% when it comes to the floor, probably in the spring, from the military budget.
And Congresswoman Lee, you are always so very good at demonstrating and explaining to folks how racism is also, to the point about the Pentagon, is a national security threat and issue. if you could just elaborate, especially in this audience, on your perspective there, because you always hit it right on home.
In terms of, rephrase that again for me, Dr. How?
Yeah, people can be understanding racism, especially, for example, the insurrection as a reflection of that as a national security threat.
Yeah, okay, yeah. And first of all, domestic terrorism is the number one priority and has been documented as being the biggest national security threat to America. But yet our FBI, Homeland Security, all of the agencies responsible for dealing with national security threats vis-a-vis the domestic threats have been missing in action. And why, we tried to figure out, but I think I know why. Because these are white supremacists, and a lot of these white supremacists are former military personnel, they're former police officers. They're very well armed, they're well trained, and a lot of them come back. It's unfortunate to come back from wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, combat ready, okay? And so you've got a white supremacist movement in this country that's been building over the years. I mean, even before Donald Trump, he just kind of was their savior and led them into the White House. But this has been building over the years. And so we have to understand national security in a larger context as it relates to domestic national security. And white supremacism, white nationalism is the greatest national security threat in this country. And we better wake up and understand that it's getting worse. And no one is exempt from the attacks and the possible violence that these individuals, which are mammoth in numbers, that they can perpetrate on your communities.
As we say in the culture, that part, what she said. And, another thing that the Congresswoman often points out, and I know folks were asking about multi-sector, is not only your representatives, but also thinking about your local chambers of commerce, and making sure that they see this as economically beneficial. When we're hearing from public health departments, thinking about mayor's offices. So far we've gotten Mayor Garcetti to be the first big city mayor to publicly endorse truth, racial healing, and transformation. But you all represent different localities and municipalities. And so thinking about how we can do this on the local level and get that voice into an echo chamber so people can see this work going is another place that I know the Congressman has often advised as places to turn the lights on for.
Sure, and at the local level, this is where it's at. This is about democracy, really engaging in your democratic responsibilities in terms of making sure your elected officials hear your voices and are accountable to you. And so the establishment of a Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission, I can't do this without you, without local communities, without organizers. Like city councils have passed resolutions supporting it, sending to their members of Congress to, yes, get on the bill and sign on to it. And so it's very important what you just said, Dr. Hunter, that local communities, because this is where all the action is going to be anyway. The commission is going to set up the national framework and give the kind of context and support local efforts. But local efforts are going to be the ones, and Dr. Christensen, who's a member of our committee, has engaged with the Kellogg Foundation and some local efforts around the country for the last few years on truth, racial healing, and transformation. So it's so important that you all do this at the local level.
Well, all right. We know you have to run to your next event. Thank you very, very much. This is not the last you'll hear from us in public health. We're here to support this work. So your leadership is appreciated.
No, listen, I'm really happy to be with you, and thank you all for taking this on, because this is another one of a truth-telling moment with what you're doing. And we have to really understand that Black people, brown people in this country have suffered tremendously through racism in the public health system. And you can see now the impact of that by the reluctance to get the vaccine. I mean, we're very skeptical about this. And we have to have trusted messengers. We have to have all of you to help us unpack this. And so keep talking about it, because it's finally our time to really begin to use the word racism, structural racism, domestic terrorism, and white supremacy. That's the moment we're in. So don't be afraid. Use your voices to use these words to put the truth in context. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, so we have time as a group, and there have been other comments in the chats as well, so let's just keep talking about this as she has encouraged us to do. Any reflections?
I did see a question inside I see two, one from Alana and one from Irene. I can address Irene and then I'll do Alana's, and of course it can open. For those of us, so for folks who are not in the chat, for those of us who advocate for health equity but are outside of California, how can we support the efforts to establish the commission? That's a great question. And one of the answers is that a lot of the resources that I mentioned before, particularly hashtag Breathe With Me, Revolution, they can take you to a series of petitions. And there's also a change.org petition that you can get folks to sign. Also, hashtag Breathe With Me has created a series of clicks that allow you to directly contact your representative and senator. So it kind of takes you through the process so you can send notice. I think the other thing for me largely, and this is just like when I think about, us just as everyday people, shout out to Sly and Family Stone, is like actually each one teach one, like tell somebody else. Because the other thing is I said, I want reparations plus, I also want us to be voting plus, that we vote for people to work for us. And when you vote for this person, if this is something you want them to work on, you notify them that you want them to work on it the same way I would notify my landlord about a faulty sink or toilet. So we need to not let our representatives off the hook post-election and instead say, no, I gave you my vote because I wanted you to do truth, racial healing, and transformation, because I wanted you to do the Anti-Racism Act. I wanted you to do this stuff. So have you signed on to this? I will hold your feet to the fire. And oftentimes that's just an email, really. And also encouraging and telling someone else If one of us tells one other person, those are two more people who are a part of the movement. So I think about it that way too, because no matter how digitized we have become, the analog word of mouth is still the #1 marketing campaign in the human experience. So the power of telling other people, especially when you are a health professional and you're a health advocate, you have a lot of power in your individual station to be a lighthouse for other people. What is waking you up or having you curious this morning? You educate that person, they edify the next person. So I would also say in your individual stations and your powerful capacity and platforms, you as an individual agent of lighthouse, sharing that information is powerful. Then to Alana's question, do you recommend any communications resources or strategies to build trust within Brown and Black communities to disseminate accurate and timely COVID-19 information? I know the Congresswoman has talked a lot about this, and she has a whole apparatus where you can find out more of her detailed information regarding COVID-19. I think the very first thing always, and this is just like I always go to the human heart space first, is to allow it in your heart that it is okay that Black people and brown people are skeptical. We cannot be shaming people into vaccination. That cannot be the strategy. Because when you use that, you diminish the history and legacy of medical racism that Black people, even if they haven't lived it in their experience, it's in their blood, they know it. Henrietta Lacks is a real case, okay? That is real. Tuskegee is real, it really happened. And that was just syphilis, okay? So if you won't give me a cure for syphilis, why do I think you'll cure me during a pandemic? So that medical skepticism should not be approached with shame, but instead with education. So one thing that I try to do is I tell people, I plan to get the vaccine. I want it as a Black person, and also I think another thing that is useful, I think, in vaccination information is something as a professor, I was not as aware of and should have been educated about. And I educated myself and other people educated me, but a vaccination is a community good, not an individual good. So a lot of times, part of what's happening in our campaigns around vaccination is we are not demonstrating the community good of the vaccine, but instead trying to get people to think about it as an individual good. And good luck with trying to tell people what they should put into their bodies or what they want to do. These are adults who get choices. And when you try to tell an adult, you need to take this because you need to do it, that's a different argument than saying, if you take it, you may protect your family. You may protect your community, where you reside, where you live, the church you care about, the congregation you are a part of. That's what a vaccine, which we all know in this room, does, but that is not how we communicate it to Black and brown communities. So also putting it out as a community good. I mean, this is what we're doing with truth, racial healing, and transformation. The truth is a community good. It isn't just about individual people feeling better or feeling vindicated. It's about us as a community moving forward, a human community being in a better place.
So, Marcus, I like this question very much that just came in. And in some states, terms like racism are political and can close many doors. What about creative ways to tackle this?
Yeah, I often, that's a point well taken, shared humanity, shared dignity, equal value, equal humanity, mutually beneficial. You know, these are the kinds of languages that we can use to also emplace those words so that people are not disarmed. But I also think it's important that we use those words and then define them with words like shared humanity. For example, racism is a mindset and belief that denies our shared humanity. That's what it is. So also using the opportunity to redefine it for someone. And I would say sometimes I like to inquire, you know, I'm a teacher. So I have students who will say, what do you mean by racism or whatever? And I'll say, well, what do you mean what do you think when you hear it? You know, what comes up for you? So sometimes it's also asking that person, oh, when you hear racism, it seems like you were put off by it. What do you hear when you hear the word racism? Because until we get to what comes up for people when the word comes up, we're not going to be able to use the word for its purpose, because we can't, you know, I'm going to paraphrase James Baldwin here. You can certainly go around something to get somewhere, but the most certain guaranteed way to something is through something. So you got to use the word to get to the other side. So you got to also figure out what is the blockage that's making it so that racism has that effect. And I think sometimes it's because white people on that diet, I mean, this is what happens. When you're fed a steady diet of racism and those kinds of privileges that come with it, it means that you don't get to see the brutality or things like that. So when people talk about it, you don't know what they're talking about. When you hear the word racism, you're predisposed and conditioned to hear people are attacking me. People are saying I'm a racist. This is about me and what I have done. Those are all about messages, codes, information that is being sent. So that's what we're up against, you know, a steady diet over many generations of different kinds of defensive tactics to get out of and contort yourself away from a conversation about racism. And one of them is to hear the word and think about it as an individual related issue and not a systemic one.
Thank you. Another question that I think is great. So how do you meet people where they are but not get stuck where they are?
Yeah, with teachers, I learned, so before I became a professor, I was a high school teacher in the Philadelphia Public School District. And one thing I learned when you put together a lesson plan, I mean, it's just old school education, pedagogy, theology, theory, and that is you meet people where they are and you have to assess where they are. So you got to ask them, where are you? You know, you find ways to do that, you know, like just like the way when you go visit a doctor, I mean, I can come in and say, and sometimes as a patient, it irritates me, you know, like I'm coming in there because my foot hurts, but you're asking me, do I have headaches? You know, do I have a cough? Did I have a sneeze? Did I go to Mexico in the last 14 days? Did I, you know, those are all assessments. So part of it is to say that we cannot start without having assessment tools, some of which are ones that may occur to us in real time that try to meet people where they are, not because they're beneath or below where they should be, but because that's just where they are. So also not evaluating where people are on a racism conversation, and instead just accepting it as where they are and then meeting them there. And I have found oftentimes when you meet people where they are on conversations around Black people, around racism, they're more likely to follow you on the road forward, more likely to follow you. But if you want to start somewhere and say, oh, you're not where I'm at, you got to go read this book, you got to go listen to this TEDx talk, you got to go hear this person, you got to go, it's like, I got to do all this homework. I don't really feel like doing that. I got bills to pay. I got children to raise. I got mouths to feed. So also finding your own practical ways. And sometimes it's really starting from a place that maybe this person has been fed a steady diet that has led to this mindset of no determination of their own. Very different disposition to orient yourself from, so that it puts you on a place of healing and not attacking, you know.
Interesting. So for most of us that are trained in public health or spent most of our lives in public health, we're trained to think a certain way about data. And I love the little bit of it that I've been exposed to in sociology, the way sociologists look at things. When we think about the truth process, the reconciliation process, the healing process, are there things we should be doing in public health differently around data collection?
Oh, that's a great question. I think one thing, and and I could be talking out of turn here, so apologies if this is not true. My experience has been public health departments don't necessarily share data with each other. So part of what I think is a way forward is if there were ways that there were data sharing agreements across municipalities or locales, because you'd be fascinated and surprised to see the shocking resemblance, for example, between the condition of Black people in San Jose and the condition of Black people in Newark on a health basis, looking at health indices. So that says to me, why are we not sharing that information and then creating aggregated data sets that allow us to really get to the kind of like systemic connections? Because there should be variated differences. I mean, people think California is this liberal bastion, but it's producing these kinds of outcomes, and how come other people don't know that? I remember being a graduate student in Chicago and often feeling like the best argument I can make to support and create policies in support of Black communities in Chicago was to use Chicago-based data only, as opposed to triaging or aggregating it in a broader horizon and spectrum of Black people across other places. And part of why that was difficult is because you can't readily always put your hands on that data. So I also think getting to a place where there's more transparency across places and more data access. I also just think for the regular population, one vision I have in public education as a former high school teacher is to actually see classes where high school students are able to play around with public health data in their city or town. That is not something that we do in high schools, so that they can familiarize themselves. Like, we know that, you know, there are teenagers who get pregnant, but those teenagers don't have access to data about what happens to Black mothers, Latino mothers, post-pregnancy, during pregnancy and such, so that those become incorporated in our high school education and curriculum. So I think data access is number one, and quietly, the digital divide is also racialized. So these are the kinds of things that help close a digital divide, because you have to create access across large distances of large quantities of information. And the more we do that, the more likely we're on higher speed Wi-Fi, we have better access programs, we are not just on Zoom University, but on other apparati that are, you know, robust enough to handle kinds of things like that. So I think it's really about creating a broader sense of public, meaning public access at every level.
Wow, yeah, so we got lots of work ahead. So keep the questions coming from Marcus. And Marcus, do you have questions that you are curious about in public, you know, our work in public health and how we can be more supportive?
Yeah, I mean, I love to hear, you know, from the group, when you hear truth, racial healing, and transformation, you know, where does that meet you at? You know, because one thing that I'm working a lot on is, you know, going around and raising awareness and talking about it. But each audience, like, you know, when I talk with sociologists, that's a particular kind of conversation. When I talk with folks that they call academicians, that's a particular kind of conversation. When I'm talking with economic, financial folks, that's a particular conversation. And so what I also want to do is sharpen my oyster knife, shout out to Zorna Hurston, in order to make sure that everybody who needs to hear this can hear it in a way that they can understand and wrap their hands around. So I would also like to hear where you all are when you hear that from the Congresswoman and myself.
For anyone who wants to respond, just take yourself off mute. It's a small enough group, we can do that. Don't be shy.
Well, I'm with Open, with the Oral Health Progress and Equity Network. And we are struggling in some ways with the reality of our name. The vast majority of the people in our network, we have about 2,000 across the nation, the vast majority are white. I have just recently been hired as the executive director, which was a very bold move on their part. And we have been really drilling into doing all of our work through an equity lens. And what we're discovering is in a lot of cases, people are becoming uncomfortable with the idea of dealing with equity and want to get more back to the oral health part. And we're working on how to help people understand that you cannot get to oral health without getting to equity first. That equity has to be for everyone in all things, and that if we keep working on it together, we can get there. But it has been a bit challenging. I think this year has made it impossible for people to deny racism, and most importantly, systemic racism. And we're working now on creating leverage points. We've mapped the oral health system, and we're creating leverage points where we can make change. And so we invite folks to join us on that journey. And any ideas, we're a real open group, unintended.
Thank you for that, Ife.
Yes.
You are so beautiful, and thank you for what you offered, in part because as you said that, I started taking notes, of course, but two, it just reminded me, I think one of our challenges, especially for those of us who are passionate about equity, and even as you're pointing out, have equity in your actual name, is that one of the major things is that the biggest opponent and antagonist for equity is the word equality. You know, that part of what's happened is you're up against a backdrop where people, and then I know I probably said this many times, like the steady diet of information, that we were on like a 50 plus, 60 plus year of diet of equality, 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 equality. So part of what happens when people hear equity is like, but what happened with equality? Oh, we're not doing that no more? Oh, what's equity? You know, and then also, you know, I'm an etymologist by vocation. You know, equality is where the A and the AL is. Equity drops the all in it, you know. So now it sounds like equal for all, ITY, versus equity, you know, like, so I think part of it is the backdrop of a kind of set of social movements that pushed equality forward as the kind of like siren song that we were all aspiring to. And now those of us who understand equity is more than equality, and it's not equality, that's why they're spelled differently, right? And it uses less letters, so it's not as pretty as the word equality, but it's very important and precise. And you might be a champion for equality, but it does not mean you support equity. So part of it is around getting, I think, putting the language out there. So what your organization is just doing in title is fighting the good fight, because too many people have been conditioned around the aspiration of equality. And sometimes equality means treating people the same, even though they have different needs, you know, like, so that's not what we want. We want there to be equity, you know, where people are getting what they need in the same society, you know. So I think your challenge is exactly right. And I think that's the challenge that we have as a people, as a nation, about returning to the politics that were successful of the civil rights movement and being sober about what has worked and what has frustrated our ability to move forward. And I think equality is one of those words where people, if you were saying that you were, you know, your organization was, instead of equity, you know, equality, you know, all of a sudden you might find people like, oh, I love that, I'm with that. And so it's like, well, what happened? And it's because equality had a whole campaign from the federal government, had a whole what was social media then, commercials and music and songs, that we have to also get that equity message out there. And it shouldn't just be on you or on me, it should be a collective national effort to reframe equity and educate the population that equality was a false aspiration. It got us only so far, and equity is maybe going to get us over the line.
So hi, Dr. Hunter. My name is Brittany Bunn. I'm a program manager here at NNPHI. First of all, thank you so much for being here with us. So excited and grateful to have you with us and just all of the knowledge you have shared. So I am familiar with a lot of the work that you all do, and I think it's great work. One of the struggles I have sometimes with the work is just kind of that multi-generational sharing. And what I mean by that is I am from a younger generation. And so I like to always tell people that this is not my grandparents' civil rights movement. And such, the way I may approach something may not be the way you approach something. And so when we look at kind of the work, my question to you is, how do we bridge that gap between the multi-generational, especially when you have a lot of people who are, fresh out of college, they are just fresh out of grad school, and we are like fired up and we're like, I want to take on the charge. But then there's also systemic ways that we need to do things, and not saying it's a bad thing, but there are rules to the game that we must play in order to get ahead. So especially as we look at kind of the work that you all are doing, what would you say for more of the younger generation? And then also and I don't know anyone's ages here, but I think everyone looks young and fabulous, but how do we recruit as well so that more people from the younger generation can take on this movement in a way that is progressive and productive and not counterintuitive, especially as we hear a lot of backlash on Black Lives Matter. And I mean, I get it from both sides, but I can also be like, when I see someone in the street struggling to breathe, I can't help but not to identify myself. When I get stopped by the cops, I'm frozen because I know what's going to happen. And when I have nephews who are trying to identify of what colorism means to them because they, understanding that Black people come in such variety of shades, what do we do to kind of bridge that gap and really take on the charge collectively? And that doesn't have to be just for people of color, but also younger folks from other, nationalities. They're ready too. They're in the streets and they're in the trenches. And we've seen that especially, in the last year with everything that's going on. So how do we all collectively come together and bridge that gap so we're not all moving in different sectors and more unifying the cause?
Thank you so much, Brittany, for that question. And also thank you for your passion and commitment. I just feel it in your question,
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I feel it in your question. I think one thing, and this is just about the kind of like cultural divide around youth and non-youth, as it were, is I think one thing is that on one side, for, let's say, older folks, and oftentimes in the movement leadership, I've represented like a bridge, because of my boyish charms. People go, oh, you look 26, so you can talk to the 26-year-olds, you get it. And I'm like, I'm not quite 26, thank you. But that said is, on one side, I believe young people have access, and this goes back to Ife's point about equity. Young people are coming in a context where equity is a word that you can use, that you can put out there. They're coming into a world where you can have cancel culture, where people are talking about sexual harassment and sexual abuse publicly, for better or for worse, where people are out here talking about the Harvey Weinsteins and they're losing their job, so I think on one side, what happens, I think, is a disconnect or creates tension, is that the youth are not aware of the new tools that have been unlocked and are at their disposal because they're dispensing with it as a part of their everyday life, that for an older generation, just the ability to use that word, or for example, where we see trust a Black woman. You know how many Black women have been going on and on about this forever? And now there's a generation that can say, Amanda Foreman represents me. Amanda Gorman represents me. Black women are beautiful. Black girl magic. Black girl, black girl. And older people go, basically I hear the message going, new tools require new rules. Don't be out here wielding these big swords and not knowing you can cut heads off. Because that's sometimes what young people wind up doing, cutting heads off in the process of expressing themselves. And when people challenge that, sometimes there's this pushback of like, you just don't want to hear from young people. And I think sometimes it's like, do you know how many centuries we live to unlock a word like anti-Blackness, unlock a word like white supremacy? So you could just be saying it right now in a professional space and you're not being cautious, careful, and generative with it. You're just chopping off heads. So I think that is the perspective that I offer, is that sometimes young people are not aware that their access to very powerful vocabulary is not being wielded as properly or with the right amount of discernment that they should have, let alone with the kind of like, wow, my ancestors gifted me this vocabulary, you know? So that's one thing. On the other side, with the elders of the group, I think it's also just about the idea that there are more young people than there are old people that way. So my auntie, who's in her 60s, she said to me, you know, they talk about I'm a baby boomer and they got these millennials out here. I've been hearing about that for a while. And, you know, I would go, whatever. And then, you know, when Hillary lost, I said, yeah, well, hot damn, they're like about to be 2/3 of the voting population. So we might not like what they got to say, but they got a lot of power and we ought to figure out what it is that they care about. So it's also about being listened to. And I think part of what happens with this around truth, racial healing, and transformation, that a power is that you can do it locally, that this is a place where you can have youth leaders enfranchised in the commission, you know, in terms of its actual architecture, so that they're not just advising or showing up to testimonials or hearings, they're actually organizing and architecting the whole experience. And they're doing it with the respect and appreciation of their elders and vice versa. But I say for young people, at least to me, and you know, I'm an analog boy in a digital world. You know, I was raised prominently in the 80s and the 90s. So I remember handwriting class. I remember learning on a typewriter. I remember word processors. I remember when I remember pagers. I remember car phones, you know, like those were real technologies that I had to learn and drop and stuff. So I have a somewhat appreciation for folks who are really like, whoa, a lot of digital stuff has happened. And there's a lot of information coming at me, and you young people just say what you mean and you just dispense with these words. And it's like, okay, so I'm a patriarch now, I'm a toxic masculinity, you know, I'm anti-feminist, you know, like that. I think young people have a responsibility to understand what those words mean, to understand the history and legacy that has allowed them access to those words, especially in a professional space, and to understand that when older folks are put off by it, they're not put off by you, but instead, you have to meet them where they are, because we would not be here without them. That is the fundamental truth. The same way that their future relies on the young people's wisdom and discernment, our present is a gift from them. So it's really getting those conversations together. And I think the local space is the space to do it. And that's the truth, what you were augmenting, Brittany. The truth is that there is a generational divide culturally, especially among Black people. You know, like we are not all unified like that, like as everybody thinks. We got our own divisions, you know, the same way humanity is divided, you know, in gender, sexual orientation, sexual identity, gender identity, Black people so too. So part of what happens is we need truth, racial healing, and transformation. So also thinking about that local process and those conversations as ways to unite, you know, those generational divides around a common purpose. And that common purpose is that young people should not be living through a kind of police system that their grandmother and grandfather understand or died because of. That should not be the case. And that I think we can all understand as a persistent reality that unifies us and we can all collectively work against.
Thanks so much. I see we have a comment, and I just want to commend anyone who's ever done a paper on a typewriter. Bless y'all. That I know that was a lot of work. So congratulations to you, but I want to turn it over to Japira. But y'all are the true golden children of the world to do that. So thank you for that, Dr. Hunter.
Hi, Dr. Hunter, Japira Hemming here. Love all of your energy and everything you shared with us. And just wanted to make a comment. You asked, how does the idea of truth and racial reconciliation how does it land on folks in the public health space? And we're about disease prevention. And so we embody and know that these structures and these systems are in place are making it hard for us to prevent disease. and the inequitable outcomes. But a lot of what you shared with us really, I think, encouraged me to think about things from an asset sort of mindset. You
Yes.
talked a lot about seeing people for their humanity. You talked a lot about what lessons we could learn from dignifying folks. And you started the conversation, I think, with a nod to Ghanaian culture. And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about lately is this idea of globally thinking. So thinking globally, but acting locally. And a lot of what I'm learning about and hearing and understanding is that other cultures treat people as holistic individuals, parts of systems, parts of communities. So when they approach health, they approach it from a holistic perspective. When they approach families, they approach it from a 2-generational perspective. And I think there's just a lot to be said for public health in America as we think about, rather than treating discrete disease and discrete outcomes, how we can think a little bit more holistically. So I think your words and your comments have left me feeling invigorated and wanting to think about how I can apply this asset thinking, apply lessons learned from seeing people as whole individuals worthy of diseases being prevented from ravishing their community. So thank you for your encouragement today, Dr. Hunter.
No, thank you for those comments. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
You're on mute, Vinny.
It must be some new program on my computer. Marcus, it's the analog computer, I think. So I want to just thank you for today. This has been great. I've been privileged to be on these weekly calls with the TRHT coalition that we're trying to move forward. So we will be glad to have folks join that. We'll get more information out to you on that. And Marcus, I think we have more work to do together. So thank you so much. Any final comments from you are more than welcome, but you've been really very generous with your time today. Thank you very much.
I just appreciate y'all, and thank you so much, sister, for the ending, because that is so rejuvenating for my spirit to hear how it landed. Thank you for reflecting that back to me, and also for augmenting it with the word dis-ease, because racism is one of the original human diseases. Thank you.